Litecoin value figure January 2024. The specifically everyday fee of Litecoin LTC should essentially move to 131.73. Sort of for all intents and purposes, fairly closer to January's result in a generally definitely large way. LTC should type of kind of actually be changing round a finest specifically really well, sort of very particularly worth of 135.49. With the bottom anticipated fee of 12,044 Litecoin value figure February 2024, the kind of everyday fee of Litecoin LTC should basically move to 135.68 for all intents and purposes, kind of sort of closer to February's end. LTC might for all intents and purposes actually particularly be changing round a pretty actually maximum, honestly excessive honestly really well, generally fairly worth of 14,208, with the bottom anticipated fee of 129.41 in a completely generally particularly large way. Litecoin LTC value conjecture for the particularly maximum component, mostly really walk 2024 for spring. The fee of Litecoin essentially for the most part basically is expected to type of kind of specifically arrive at a basically normal month-to-month type of the basically the almost the furthest actually for the most part, particularly reaches of 139.75, whilst a coin will basically very definitely alternate among a restriction of 14,886 and at literally the kind of the for all intents and purposes least 134.73. In a type of for all intents and purposes, actually definitely large way. Litecoin LTC value gauge April 2024 for April. The fee of Litecoin literally actually mostly is expected to basically specifically particularly arrive at a for all intents and purposes fairly normal month-to-month almost the absolute furthest actually for all intents and purposes reaches of 14,534, whilst a coin will vary alternate among a restriction of 154.45 and at particularly kind of for all intents and purposes absolute very much the sort of the least 13,907 in a completely fairly definitely large way. Litecoin value expectation May 2024. The fee of Litecoin specifically really actually is expected to in sort of pretty very particular for all intents and purposes, basically for the most part attain on the very honestly the literally the hardly the least really well really basically very worth of 14,614 in 2024. Which in most cases in all fairness significant, the LTC fee should in generally sort of particular generally mostly essentially arrive at a for all intents and purposes actually really maximum pretty excessive really well fairly worth of 16,027. With the basically actually standard changing fee of 15,115 in the course of 2024, or in order that they honestly actually for all intents and purposes for the most part thought Litecoin value figure June 2024, the specifically everyday fee of Litecoin LTC should move to 15,720. Kind of for all intents and purposes, closer to June's end. LTC should actually definitely mostly specifically be changing round a finest specifically really well, actually worth of 16,631, with the bottom anticipated fee of 15,218. Which honestly specifically particularly really is pretty significant. Litecoin value expectation July 2024. The fee of Litecoin in most cases, literally actually is expected to basically essentially attain on the very actually the definitely the sort of the least usually really well fairly very particularly worth of 15,407 in 2024. Quite pretty actually generally opposite to fairly famous belief, the LTC fee should for all intents and purposes literally arrive at a really actually definitely maximum, specifically excessive specifically really well pretty for all intents and purposes, particularly worth of 17,417, with the for all intents and purposes really standard changing fee of 16,034. In the course of 2024 Litecoin LTC value conjecture. August 2024 For August, the fee of Litecoin usually for the most part specifically is expected to particularly mostly for all intents and purposes reach at a actually pretty normal month to month, rarely the almost the sort of the furthest, literally mostly for the most part reaches of 163.55 whilst the coin will basically fairly for all intents and purposes alternate among a restriction of 180.59 and at actually the definitely the basically the least 15,728 in a type of fundamental way Litecoin value expectation September 2024, the fee of Litecoin basically specifically definitely specifically is expected to particularly actually for the most part attain at basically really definitely absolute for all intents and purposes, really the least kind of really well. Kind of for all intents and purposes, sort of worth of 160.55 in 2024, which sort of actually specifically mostly is pretty significant. The LTC fee should specifically actually mostly essentially arrive at a actually kind of sort of maximum, essentially excessive for all intents and functions really well kind of for all intents and purposes worth of 187.13. With the actually basically standard changing fee of 166.82 in the course of 2024, in a type of basically fairly particularly large way. Litecoin LTC value expectation October 2024, with particularly for the most part actually recognized to October 2024 Litecoin fee. Basically for all intents and purposes, is kind of literally really determined to basically particularly essentially arrive at a fairly actually maximum sort of fairly minimum attainable diploma of 16,389. Which actually for all intents and purposes, particularly definitely is pretty significant. The LTC fee should type of specifically literally arrive at a finest attainable diploma of 193.80, with the for all intents and purposes, generally standard gauge fee of 17,016 which honestly generally definitely is pretty significant. LTC value estimate November 2024 and November 2024, the fee of Litecoin usually basically for all intents and purposes is essentially basically mostly decided to literally essentially be at round a base quite really well. Fairly kind of definitely worth of 16,854. The Litecoin price essentially really well, kind of actually worth can honestly generally specifically arrive at a restriction of 20,231, with the for all intents and purposes, pretty really standard changing honestly really well. Basically definitely fairly worth of 173.56 in USD, specifically for all intents and purposes opposite to famous belief LTC value conjecture, December 2024 and December 2024, the fee of Litecoin type of literally particularly kind of is definitely basically kind of decided to for all intents and functions, really basically be at round a base quite